Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas. In our ongoing study in Corinthians by Paul, dated AD 56, we're going to take a look at the lordship of Teleiosis of Christ. And now Paul is going to concentrate on the absolute conclusion of the Teleiosis of lordship as the returning Parousia, returning advent of Christ. Let's begin with block one. We're going to take a look at Elpizo hope is resurrection based. And Paul says, now already Christ has been raised from the dead. He is the aparche, he is the first fruits of those who sleep in death. So the first thing Paul does is he tells us that Christ inaugurates the resurrection process. He's the first fruits of resurrection and the first fruits of our hope in resurrection. And he goes on in verse 21 and he says, by one man came death, and by one man comes resurrection of the dead. And then in verse 22 he says that for in Adam all humanity perished. However, in Christ all will be made alive in resurrection. So if you look at note 4, we'll take a look at our conclusion there. We've got 1, Christ has been raised up for all creation. 2, death has been defeated by resurrection. And 3, believers in Christ are made alive now and eternally. And I got a few comments here from Ciampa and Rosner, their commentary. Christ's final representation of the human race reverses the corruption by the first representation. First fruits was that portion of offering given in thanksgiving to God and the temple, or the tabernacle. And then eschatological resolution takes place through the resurrection by Jesus Christ. Christ is the first fruits of resurrection, and he is the power of resurrection. Remember, when he spoke to Martha, he said, I am the resurrection. So Paul begins with aparche. He begins with aparche. Christ is the first fruits of resurrection. Now we're going to move into that important second moment. We're going to take a look at parousia. In verse 23, Paul says that each person, however, in his own order shall be resurrected. Christ is the first fruits, then those who are of Christ, and that will occur at his advent second coming. In verse 24, Paul makes the tremendous statement about the end of teleiosis. He's already said Christ is the beginning. He is the first fruits. Now he's going to tell us in verse 24 that Christ is the conclusion of the lordship of teleiosis. Then the end of teleiosis comes, when Christ shall bring forth the kingdom. And he shall bring to nothing all secular dominion, all secular authorities, all secular powers. Paul mentions all three specifically, that Christ shall bring the absolute subjection of all dominions, all orders, all powers. Then let's go on and take a look at verse 25. And Paul says this process is a necessity. It's a necessity for Christ to reign until Christ has put all of his enemies under his feet. Christ will reign in lordship until all of creation is put into subjection under Christ. He will reign as Kyrios Lord. He has been exalted to the right hand of the Father as Kyrios Lord, and he will reign as Kyrios Lord until all of his enemies have been brought into subjection under the Messiah, Christ. So take a look at note 4. We'll take a look at our wrap up here for the second block. Christ is the first fruits of resurrection. Then those who are of Christ will be resurrected at the Parousia, returning advent. This marks the fulfillment of divine teleiosis, where all secular authority will be subjected to Jesus Christ. And I got a few comments here from Ciampa and Rosner. Paul is fully focused on the question of the resurrection of the righteous in Christ. There's a time gap between the resurrection of Christ and those who belong to him. And Christ will reign until all enemies are subdued. And that comes from Psalm 110:1. The wisdom literature of Psalm 110:1. So Paul has brought us the concepts of aparche. Christ inaugurates resurrection as first fruits, and parousia, Christ is the end of the lordship movement of teleiosis. And now we're going to take a look at the goal of teleiosis, which is for God to be all in all. That's in block 3. The goal of teleiosis is for God the Father to be all in all. Verse 26, the last enemy to be defeated will be death itself. Because Christ will have put all things into subjection under his feet. And when it is declared that all things have been put into subjection, it will be obvious that Christ, says Paul, who put all these things into subjection, is himself, aside from all of this, as the agent of putting all things into subjection. But he's aside from this. He is part of the eternal Godhead. He is aside from the actual movement. He is the agent of that movement, of that lordship. And then, key, verse 28, when everything has been brought into subjection under Christ, everything under Christ, then the Son himself, Christ himself, will put himself into subjection unto the Father. And in that way, God will be all in all. So it's a picture of Christ as the empowering agent and his empowering kurios lordship of bringing all into subjection under Jesus Christ. When that occurs, and when it can be declared that it has been fulfilled, when that can be stated as complete, then Christ will in turn subject himself to the Father. The living God will be all in all creation. All of heaven will have come down and indwelt all of creation. Heaven will meet earth fully. All of heaven indwelling all of earth. God will be all in all. Christ is the agent and the Lord who ensures the fulfillment of this teleiosis that is headed toward God the Father becoming all in all. So if you take a look at note 4, the last enemy defeated is death itself. By a process of putting all things into subjection, Christ himself will be aside from this as the enabling agent. And then, the great conclusive then, as a final act, Christ will put himself in subjection to the Father, that God might be all in all. There's that conclusive tate, the great conclusive then, the finality act. Christ will put himself into subjection unto the Father, that God the Father might be all in all, that all of divine will internalize and indwell all of creation. Full restoration will be completed. I got a few notes here from Ciampa and Rosner. Christ's mission includes the destruction of death itself. Psalm 8 has the language of everything being placed into submission. and Christ's office as king consists of reasserting God's kingly power against the disobedient. Christ represents God's kingly power through his kingly office. But from here we want to take a look at the way that Paul wraps up this teaching, and the way he wraps it up is to address the Corinthian membership and use the imperative awaken, awaken, awaken spiritually. He says they're being closed-minded about something. They're entrapping themselves in darkness, and we want to take a look at that awakening in column 4. In column 4, we look at the concept of eknephos, and if you look at the bottom of column 4, I've got a definition there. Eknepho means to come to one's senses, to awaken from, and to come out of the cloud of spiritual darkness. Eknepho, or eknephos, means to come out of the cloud of spiritual darkness, to wake up. We're going to take a look at that in verses 32 through 34. And Paul says, if according to mankind I quarreled with a dangerous adversary in Ephesus, what advantage is it to me if the dead are not raised up? Why would I even want to be involved in a ministry against a great adversary in Ephesus? And Paul really did consider Ephesus the greatest challenge to his ministry. But he said, why would I have engaged with an adversary, a spiritual adversary in Ephesus, if there was no resurrection from the dead? If there was no egeiro power of raising up and resurrection? What advantage is that to me if the dead are not raised up? We should just simply eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. In verse 33, he concludes, therefore, he says, therefore, the imperative, be not deceived. Be not deceived by corrupt companionships that will take your good character and push it into becoming an improper and bad character, out of alignment with Christ. So don't be deceived by false, negative companionships. Stay aligned with Christ. And that brings us to 34. Wake up. Eknepho, awaken. Awaken to righteousness, he says. Awaken to righteousness and sin not, because some of you are ignorant of God. Some of you are agnosia. Some of you are acting like atheists. Some of you are blocking the wisdom of God. And he said, I speak this imperative to you to your shame. So it's a very severe rebuke. Paul says, wake up out of this delusion, out of this spiritual darkness. Negate this spiritual darkness. Some of you, not all of you, but some of you are acting like atheists. Some of you are being agnosia, and gnosis is to know, and a is to negate. Some of you are against knowing. Some of you are acting like atheists. You're blocking the wisdom of God in Christ, and you're engaging in false companionships that are destructive to spiritual existence and to the church. And Paul says, eknepho, wake up. Wake up out of this spiritual delusion. Wake up out of this falling off the straight path. It's time to wake up to dikaiosune righteousness. Wake up to righteousness. So let's take a look at note 4 for column 4. Christian life involves a battle with a dangerous adversary. 2, Christ's lordship of raising up, egeiro power. He raises up creation, and that's the only answer to this struggle. And 3, therefore, negate agnostic tendencies and awaken to dikaiosune righteousness. Awaken to dikaiosune righteousness. That is Paul's imperative lesson here. But we get there through aparche, Christ inaugurating the lordship of Teleiosis, Parousia, Christ as the fulfillment, the telos of teleosis, and then our response, which is supposed to be a participation of eknepho, awakening out of spiritual darkness. So we've got aparche, parousia, telos, and eknepho. Aparche, parousia, telos, and eknepho. But we will take a look at a recall triad and a 4-point focus in our next lesson, but it is a fantastic teaching from Paul on the telos of teleosis.